Hello again. My name is Marlon, and I am a solutions architect and product lead here at Globant. I will be your host today. And some initial housekeeping issues to consider. Please write any questions you may have about our conversation in the Q&A window that you see in Zoom, and we will try to answer as many as we can once we get to the end of our discussions. So with housekeeping out of the way, let's get started. Streaming content is everywhere. The popularity and ubiquity of over-the-top services have exploded across the globe. So where do we as technology providers and service operators currently stand, and what's next? We will look to a panel of key players in the OTT world that we've gathered today with our questions in this webinar. They're going to lead us into topics such as metadata, ML and AI, analytics, strategies on monetization, among others. So let me introduce you to our panel today, starting with Luke Dyer. He's a streaming media specialist with more than a decade of experience driving the digital future of television. He's responsible for customer engineering at Google Cloud Media Services. And there he facilitates technology adoption by broadcasters and media companies. Next panelist is Justin Hoyman, Senior Product Manager for the native apps and live scoring teams at Flow Sports, and spanned the last 9 years between CBS Sports and Flow Sports, building mobile and TV apps that support some of the biggest sporting events in the world, including the Super Bowl. Awesome. Next up, we have Barclay Kern. Barclay is a business consultant who specializes in streaming media solutions, TV everywhere, television programming metadata, website analytics, strategy development, and SEO. He is based in beautiful Santa Barbara, California. We also have Audrey Koo. Audrey is the head of pre-sales global at Linus Technologies. Audrey is looking at where AI leads OTT in the future. She has a vast experience in the digital media entertainment space, having worked for broadcasters, telco, and startups on video technology and its digital strategy for successful transformation. Last but not least, we have Charlie Novacek. Charlie is the apps team engineering manager at Flow Sports. Charlie has 7 years experience building consumer-facing applications for live streaming, mobile payments, and social networks. He currently lives in Austin, Texas with his family. So let's get started with our conversation. Our first topic that we're gonna hit is one of my favorites and also one that makes me pull my hair out almost every day, and that's the topic of metadata. So we are in the age of data, and AI and machine learning brings a lot of promise around automation and operational efficiencies. But there are still some underlying gaps around the basics, such as standardization and organization. Barclay, can you speak to some of the current challenges and what strategies operators are doing to kind of minimize the impact, and what are you looking for from us service providers to help with that?
Well, thanks, Marlon, and thanks everybody for joining us on the webinar. Yeah, there's no question that artificial intelligence and machine learning are definitely exciting and promising players in the metadata space. Because metadata is so vital to all of us. It drives recommendations, which drives content discovery, and that's clearly a massive challenge in the OTT space. I was looking at some research ahead of this webinar. Found a study that TiVo did, published last year, mentioned that the average video consumer spends 19 minutes a day just looking for something to watch. And they report, not surprisingly, a pretty high level of frustration with that. With discovery, that's true. I mean, there's such a glut of content. So it's a huge challenge. And there's definitely frustration with that process, but users also report that they very much rely on those recommendation engines. There was the Q3 study from Nielsen released last week that mentioned that 50% of those viewing choices are driven by those recommendation engines. So I work with content owners, and the big challenge for them is sort of the same kind of thing we dealt with SEO in the web. which is how to pick, how to not game the system, but how to understand how to position your metadata when the secret sauce, the algorithms, are proprietary information. So any kind of guidance that can be provided to just provide the right simple things like the genres and the keywords to make sure that they make sense and that your content is populated, your metadata exists with contains those relevant fields, is vital for a content owner to have a fighting chance of cutting through the clutter, as it were.
Luke, Audrey, or any one of our other panelists, do you want to add to that? Oh. I think you're on mute there.
Yeah, no, I can chime in there. I was taking a couple notes based off Barclay's comments. I think those were good, especially as it relates to sort of the challenge on the consumer side. So you mentioned the challenges, for operators and what service providers are doing. I think making those tools easier to extract metadata. So I think one of the challenges we see as it relates to using machine learning is the difficulty or the expertise within an organization to leverage it. So you have millions of developers essentially that understand APIs, understand how to program sort of any of the common programming languages, and then you have sort of low double-digit thousands of data scientists who may have some experience of ML, and then you have kind of even fewer ML experts out there, right? So being able to take and provide key services and APIs that allow you to do things like extract caption data, do speech to text, or extract objects and enhance or enrich those videos is one of the areas that we're really focused on. Being able to do things that any of those millions of developers can do, rather than the tens of thousands of data scientists or ML experts. And we see that definitely affecting projects that are being done today. Those are using existing data sets, so also kind of minimizing the overhead that you need for generating your own data set, being able to take existing data sets, and we've open sourced a lot of different data sets. In fact, I even bought a company with about 15,000 data sets to help advance the use of machine learning for video. There's a great data set out there. YouTube 8M is a great data set out there, which has about 6.5 million videos out there that I know Fox leveraged, for example, in a case study they did with us to actually help them predict box office revenues or box office receipts based on types of movies that they could create, based on machine learning and being able to take both their own data as well as open data that existed and determine how they would create compelling content based on the trends, and not just the intuition of the producer, but actually what's being watched online and what's being viewed in box office. So we see both kind of the real-time challenges and then the way that producers and operators and service providers are really kind of taking data and making use of it.
Great. Anyone else want to chime in on that one, or should we go to the next question? All right. On the topic of data, there are a number of services and points of analytics collection right now, right? We have the player, the CDN, various third-party services that collect data. And from what I've seen out there, the data doesn't always line up across these various data points, right? And oftentimes there's discrepancies, and you don't know which set of data to believe or what to make out of it. So what are some of the specific strategies to making sense of all this disparate information, and what are the keys to focus on as a service provider? And Barclay, do you want to start with us off on that one as well? Or?
Well, you're absolutely right. It's a good question, Marlon, because as someone in the digital video space, you're going to end up with multiple dashboards of analytics that you're tasked with trying to interpret, and the measurements can be different across those platforms. And so I'm not aware of a single solution. It would be great if a service provider could do that, but obviously because the distribution chain for the content, touches different platforms, there's going to be different measurements made along the way. And so, someone who's trying to interpret that for a client has to, in a sense, settle on the KPIs that are important for the objective of the report, of what they're trying to understand about the consumption, all the sort of quality of experience metrics that are relevant to making decisions about the content they create and how successful it is at reaching the audience. I'm not aware of a silver bullet sort of solution that can make sense of it. So the real challenge is picking the metrics that make sense for the client, make sense for what you're trying to understand, and being consistent in terms of measuring those, not sort of changing horses midstream until something more comprehensive comes along. I'd be curious what other folks think.
Yeah. And Charlie, can I jump in there?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a problem that we face, especially here, is sort of on the consumer end of those metrics. As a sports media company, we have different teams that care about different key metrics. Our operations team, they care about QoE metrics with our live streams. Our content marketers, they care about the marketing metrics attached to replays and other VOD content. And then our product team, we care about kind of user engagement and kind of funnel type metrics. And a lot of times there's overlap in different providers in terms of what metrics get delivered to us. And after speaking with our data team and kind of understanding how they solve this challenge, they were kind of a strategy that they decided was really effective was to choose one source of truth for each one of those metrics, even when there's overlap. And when you decide to choose that source of truth, really vet it. Once you are confident in the source of truth for each one of these different metrics, then it becomes a lot easier to rely upon them to make sort of these product decisions. For instance, we had an instance where we wanted to vet a collection source for video view counts because it was coming from different places. And so we chose one, and then we found a video that hadn't been viewed in the past year. It was kind of on the long tail of content, and our data analysts sat there and kind of viewed at different increments, seeked at different times, and then waited for our ETL to run the next day, and then kind of looked at the data from the different sources and determined which one was the most accurate based upon his real world use case of looking at the data. And so that's one way to kind of vet that source of truth for its integrity. And on the operator's side, it's important to understand how these different vendors are collecting and aggregating and defining these metrics. So we use a company called Segment for all of our kind of ETL and aggregation of these different types of vendors. And each one defines session slightly differently. And so it's really important when you're collecting a metric to understand how these different vendors are aggregating and defining what a session is, for example. Because that way, when you do see disparity between different providers, that gives you a little bit more insight into which one might be the most accurate given your particular use case.
Great. Thank you, Charlie. Great points there. Does anyone else want to jump in on this one? Audrey, or should we move along? All right, we're gonna jump from data and do a quick kind of lightning round across the panel question. So one of the topics that is the buzzword du jour right now is 5G. So if you guys can quickly go around, and is it reality or hype, and when do you think it will truly hit? Charlie, do you want to start us off?
I don't know a whole lot about 5G, admittedly. I should probably know a lot more, but I imagine that we are going to have some sort of technological bump in our cellular data delivery. And so I'm going to call that 5G. I'm going to call it real. I don't know when it's going to happen.
Luke.
Yeah, so I think if the question's reality or hype, I think, right, hype is probably hit, but reality is probably still a while away until maybe I think kind of it starts rolling out more universally in 2020, or that's sort of the suggested date, although some networks have started rolling it out now. I think most feedback on that has been that it's not much better than your current LTE, because I think there's some network backhaul and some other things that still need to be put into effect. But I see this being big in terms of transitioning video to IP and being able to give access to more people in terms of a high quality experience for networks. I think things that'll be hit like hotel networks and poor networks that people are charging dearly for today, you'll be able to get that directly over your phone, be able to get, access to things like 4K over your standard network to connected devices. So I see this being a big area that'll affect M&A and affect a lot of industries as they sort of transition for it.
All right. Audrey?
I definitely see this one's going to be a big hit. However, though, there's quite a few technologies that also need to catch up on supporting, obviously, video transmission over 4G, making sure the backend system, the playout systems, all actually supports it. So for now, I think we're more involved over discovery, investigation, obviously, for the network providers to actually look into it, and also for everyone, all the industries that touches videos or video related to video to catch up on those, and also investigate when it hits, can we actually, we will be able to take it on, and but don't think right now, but definitely is one of the hot topics that people will keep in R&D spaces, or keep an eye on to make sure that when it comes, we're all ready for it.
All right. Thank you, Henry. Justin?
Yeah, I echo a lot of what Luke had to say. I mean, I think, for the most part, it's a lot of hype at just given where it's at. But I think, probably some of the first places you'll see it impact are maybe sports stadiums and places like that are in, areas where 5G is beginning to roll out. You might start to see some immediate impact, and maybe we'll get a sense of kind of what kind of a game changer it could be. But, otherwise, I do think it's a reality, over time. So time will really tell.
Right. And then let's wrap it up with Berkeley.
Yeah, I mean, you said, is it hype? Is it reality? And I think the answer is yes. I mean, no, it's both of those things. I mean, the hype is so exciting, right? I mean, I was at CES earlier this year, and it was all over the place, and they're talking about 20 gigabyte downstream to a mobile device. That's if it works, or it does work. The problem is the technical limitations, as the other panelists have talked about, are significant, because if I'm not mistaken, it's operating at a higher frequency than standard 3G LTE, or 4G rather LTE, which means longer bandwidth, which makes it significantly susceptible to terrestrial interference. So you're talking about line of sight, talking about dense population, or the densely populated areas, probably getting this service first. It's obviously been rolled out in several Asian countries. So it has significant implications for IoT, significant implications for autonomous driving, because of the amount of data that you can transfer across it if it works. But I think you're going to see it in the United States starting in densely populated urban areas because of the technical limitations of needing line of sight and significant amounts of repeaters. It's going to take a while, conventional wisdom, for it to roll out to the sort of national network that a lot of people are accustomed to with 4G. But it is very exciting to read about. Offers a significant amount of promise in the video, circling back to the video space, to be able to deliver 4K, 8K. I mean, what would feel like infinite bandwidth to us today, based on what we're doing. I mean, I still struggle to get text messages sometimes. So it can't happen soon enough, but there's a significant amount of investment in technology, I think, that's still to come.
Great. All right. Thanks all. Some good points there. And I think you hit it right on the head, Berkeley. I think it's both reality and hype. So jumping into the next area of conversation. One of the biggest challenges still facing OTT is the perception or the reality of issues with latency and synchronicity. And nobody wants to be the one hearing their neighbors cheer a goal, right, 30 seconds before they see it, or having being in a sports bar and having half the room cheer before the other half and being out of sync. So where are we today with that? What can be done about it? And what's the current impact for live sporting events? And how do we make this a non-issue? Justin, do you want to kick us off with this one? I mean, this is right up your alley, right? In the sports world.
Yeah, absolutely. This is highly relevant to us, and it's a really interesting problem. As rights holders have more options than ever, and you see live sports moving away from linear. This is going to be more and more problematic, and it's always interesting when you find new technology facing problems that have already been solved with the technology that it's replacing. And so, this is a problem it's a macro issue. And, we've run into it with Flow Sports, as we're starting to get larger and larger rights. We're in fan bases that have large followings they'll typically go to the local bar and stream. And, what you'll find is, instead of just being able to stream live through their linear and the AV setup that they've had for who knows however many years that it worked the way it always worked, now all of a sudden they need, some sort of device or mechanism to get that stream up onto the different TVs. And that's something that we've been looking at closely lately. And, some of the different solutions that we've, looked at are, some feel a little bit archaic. It's like, well, there are some AV methods that are alternatives to what they're doing today. We've seen some software solutions that claim to be able to synchronize the video across the devices and sort of play as like a middleman. But, looking at that, it feels like perhaps that doesn't scale industry-wide, because that would basically mean that every OTT provider would need to have some sort of SDK integrations in all of their clients. And for me, I think that's a red flag. And then I look at it like an ideal solution would be something that gets handled on the OS level or the hardware level, where your Apples and Googles and Amazons can kind of solve it for all of the services that are being provided on their platforms. That, I don't know if, that's, you start to see movement there with AirPlay 2 and Chromecast, from an audio perspective. I don't know if I've got to think that that's sort of the next step as it relates to, multi-room viewing and so forth. Because you're at a bar, you're going to have potentially 20 different TVs that need to have that stream up. And that would be an awful experience to have your neighbors yelling before you. And then perhaps, it's in waves, throughout the bar. And so that's a real issue. And at this point, I don't know what the right answer is going to be, but I know what I hope it is.
Luke, I know this is an area you've been looking at very closely, the ultra low latency. Do you want to cover what you guys are looking at?
Yeah, I was gonna chime in there. I think you kind of stated it as one of the biggest challenges. I think in many cases it's not a challenge, because a lot of content, maybe the majority of content online, is actually not live, right? So sports, news, perhaps you could lump social live activity in there. That's really those are the compelling things that people want to see live. And oftentimes with sports, if that's in a home environment, a lot of the broadcasters I talk to, they're not as concerned at this point, because they're in the home, and so somebody's not pulling it up on their mobile device also while they're in the home. They're watching it on their TV, which is coming over broadcast. I think, though, more and more, the latency discussion's going full circle, though sometimes it's conflated with network latency or round trip time and screen to screen. Those kind of all get lumped in together. I think more and more, as you see things like gaming sort of take the lead in terms of how it's adapting its technology to address the demands of an audience that wants things now and wants things, they want to have those social experiences. I think, definitely sports broadcasters, as they look at like what esports is doing, how do they create, fan driven experiences that are equal to that or continue to exceed that, and not, be subject to kind of the broadcast way of doing things or the high production level things that introduce kind of natural latency. So if you're watching the news, I think for Google, we just announced the other day Stadia, which is kind of a continuation of the project Stream, I'm sorry, which is doing ultra low latency gaming. So being able to deliver 60 frames per second, 1080p video in under, definitely under 100 milliseconds, right? I think those are the types of things that really looking at how do you do video delivery differently without inheriting some of what we often talk about in OTT is like, how do you convert a broadcast workflow, or how do you convert these technologies that sort of introduce their own natural latency and have their own production workflow steps, oftentimes specs and standards. We all know sort of the subject and rules of HLS and Dash and segment packaging and all those things that are being worked on. But I think there are other ways of approaching that technology. I think gaming is one of those areas that I'm definitely continue to watch, and I think will continue to kind of teach us and inform some of the broadcast approaches that maybe for things like sports and instant news that is really relevant to that audience. They want to get that. They may sort of adapt either a hybrid track of sort of here's your OTT model, but here's our kind of low latency model with maybe more fan-rich, interactive, fan-engaging experiences. And then, maybe those ultimately one of those subsumes the other. We'll see. But that continues to be definitely an area of interest and an area of investment.
Okay. Thank you. So there's a big focus from the OTT providers on increasing audience engagement and monetization through hyper-personalization and discovery through various AI machine learning algorithms. Beyond the buzzwords and marketing hype, where is this going to take us? And is there a potential threat of creating bubbles as we are currently seeing in the social media world in terms of like the political bubble that you're getting on Facebook, your personal bubble? Audrey, do you want to cover that one? I know you're heavily involved in the personalization space.
Sure. Definitely. So this ties in together sort of with the question one around the metadata around the video. And there's so many sources around now that we can actually capture a video metadata, whether it comes from the existing video itself, people manually enter them in, or additional text gets generated by the big four companies, Recognition, AutoML, Microsoft Video Indexer, or some people use Watson. As well as there's a lot of niche market or niche AI sets out there that actually generates, sort of analyze it furthermore down into, say, sports specific, where they'll grab event details, they'll grab time-based metadata that can also all be associated to your video. So when you actually do a search, you can really personalize your content to your audience. You can tie all that three things in to your user profiles, as well as your the video metadata that you have, as well as your time-based metadata based on what they've platforms, subscriptions, all tie that together to say, I'm really going to target you, what you watched, and the ads I'm going to serve you. For example, the ads which I'm interested in as a female may be different to Marlon as a male, and also given different age group or a different interest. So that also comes in another challenge is, when can we actually break into an ad? So a lot of rights holders, studios, all have there's certain really strict rules around where you can actually enter in, or where you can actually cut in to actually monetize your content. That doesn't happen so much around sports because there's sort of more of a defined break that people can say. But then in sports, hyper-personalization also massive because you want to be fed your the information that you want to see, such as your favorite team, your favorite player, when they score the goal, things like that. So you really want to, well, that's the next phase in terms of what people are trying to get to, a fan-based driven platform, what they can pick and choose what they want. They don't want to see the whole game. They only want to see certain events and actions based on their favorite players. This is also growing very big in esport as well, as people are like, ooh, I'm not massive in esport, but people goes, oh, there's avatars, there's multi-kills, there's things that people want to see like back to back, and it's cool and they want to show it to your friend. Additionally, people also want to talk about mashup content, so potentially playing around with the words, with production content as well as uploaded content, and just what the next generation will do. So this is all part of the hyper-personalization experience, which either the next generation or the next phase people want to get to. And then ties back, but to get to that really ties back to the metadata that we have, the amount of metadata, time-based metadata that we can now have against a video content, as well as understand your user. The platform needs to be able to support it in terms of what we've also talked about, the quick turnaround, making sure that people can actually get the content and not wait for a 5 to 10 second delay because of network, because of the processing. So yes, the social media bubbles, the Facebook bubbles, definitely something where people will be targeting, and that once we've done it, it will then open up more on the media entertainment, on the really strict studio rights, where they go, oh, that's another area where they can monetize their content.
All right, thank you, Ronnie. Charlie, do you have some thoughts on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this hyper-personalization of content in advertisement definitely leads to bubbles. Anecdotally, I love YouTube. I watch YouTube more than just about any other media platform, and consistently, the only ad I was delivered for 4 months, the only ad was a Peloton commercial, and I've never wanted a Peloton. I've never bought a Peloton in that 4 months. I still would probably never buy a Peloton, but so the risk is definitely real. With the way that we're starting to get more interested in content recommendation and personalization at Flow Sports, and we're sort of trying to solve a little bit of the opposite to this bubble problem. One of the problems that we face, one of the challenges is we focus specifically on certain sports, and since people come and subscribe to Flow Sports for certain events, we have a very seasonal audience in terms of people will sign up and they'll subscribe for a particular season in that sport. When we want to talk about driving longer engagement and retention with these customers, that becomes a pretty big barrier. And so if we focus too much on hyper-personalizing that experience around a particular sport, we can fall into a trap of just entrenching those subscribers into a seasonal sort of cycle. And so one way we have some strategies to try to break this is to present sort of tangentially related sports or tangentially related content that's out of season that we think will continue to engage with that user. For instance, so we've got wrestling is a very large audience that we focus on, but so is grappling. And we've noticed in our data that there's a lot of overlap between grappling fans and wrestling fans, or MMA fans and grappling fans, or dance and cheerleading. And so that's one way that we can try to pop that bubble in terms of hyper-personalization, is to have proper feedback loops and really good data analytics to recognize opportunities that maybe machine learning or particular algorithms might miss, and kind of find this local maximum in terms of engagement. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
I think, can I jump in first? Because I think I really liked your point, Charlie. And you know, there's that we call, I guess I would refer to it, and I've read this other places, the hyper personalization of content that you're exposed to on digital platforms has kind of a creepy factor to it at times. Yeah, and some of it is, I mean, your story about YouTube sort of badgering you with this Peloton ad just goes to show how far they still have, we still have to go, because you're talking about just another sophistication layer added to the metadata question, because this is, to me, all driven off metadata. And if the metadata, if the algorithm is just looking at, okay, Barkley likes, rom-coms as movies, and And that's just it. That's the depth of the metadata where, okay, every rom-com we're going to throw at him. So wait a minute, maybe he likes rom-coms that star, Matthew McConaughey or something. That's another level of metadata. I mean, the trick is, and this is where I think machine learning and AI, in theory, offer a lot of promise because they can just crunch so much more data. They can get a lot more sophisticated because it really does need to get better. We're all digital sort of natives at this point, and it's frustrating when you get the same ad, especially if you had purchased a Peloton and they're still trying to sell it to you. So there's so much room for improvement on that space. But at the end of the day, it's all about driving engagement, right? I mean, because that's the reason you would want a personalized experience, because it's more to your liking. We just have to get a better job at understanding what those likes are.
Great stuff. Good conversation.
If I could chime in too, just a quick thought. I think you asked sort of where does this take us, and I think personally, I think like right now we're sort of going through this transition of unbundling, right? And I think ultimately that will lead back to a transition of bundling again, because I think these bubbles exist because you're on Netflix, you might also be on HBO, you might also maybe you're not on Prime because you can't afford 6 different $10 subscriptions in addition to your internet bill. And so I think like ultimately where you go find this content and right now you're having to navigate essentially across multiple different apps to go get content and go search for content. And Barkley started this off talking about 19 minutes a day. I think that's certainly relevant for anybody who's navigating on a mobile device or navigating on their connected TV to go find content across different apps. And so I think being able to bridge that gap in terms of finding and recommending content, creating whether it's hyper local channels, hyper targeted channels. I think for sports, most sports providers are sort of doing this today and recommending specific teams and players. But I think where content costs are certainly high and content acquisition is certainly high, it will sort of beg the response of how do more partnerships take place? How do people start cross-pollinating content across platforms that we might look at as very separate platforms today? But I think a lot of the platforms more and more are sort of JVs between companies and between groups trying to get content out there because of the cost of acquisition of new users is very high, but the cost to put another library online to an existing service that's already got a great user base, like that's going to continue to come down with cloud solutions and ways to get that content online easily. So I think just to the point of where does this take us, I think it just continues to how do we evolve to create better user experiences, and I don't think that experience is navigating across 10 different apps.
Luke, you touched on one of the topics that we've got in our questions from Alejandro. Actually, if you want to take a stab at this one, how far are we from providing full customized content offering versus massive bundles? So a la carte versus massive bundles, and what are the business constraints around that?
Yeah, I guess I kind of touched on it. I don't know what more to add to my answer. I think it very much is cost per user acquisition. Marketing tends to be one of the biggest hurdles for any new OTT service or any thriving OTT service. How do they sort of get to the next level? It's about either getting more content to bring a larger audience, and the cost of that user acquisition is pretty high, and I think that's increasingly competitive. There's obviously been announcements this week leading to sort of new services, and those services already have significant subscriber bases. And so if you're sort of just getting started, I mean, there's plenty of room for niche audiences, but I think those niche audiences ultimately will be attractive to some of those big platforms. And so I think there's a great place for those niche content providers or smaller audiences. But I think that, M&A will continue to drive the topics we've talked about, 5G, ATSC 3.0, all this stuff is going to IP. And ultimately, if you've got content that's got an audience and you can market it, that's going to be really valuable. So I don't know what the timeline is to Alejandro's question, but I think that's certainly a trend that's continuing.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, we're running close out of time and a number of questions I'd love to chat with you all about. Let's do one more lightning round question before we hop into the Q&A period. So what is the one area or technology or innovation that excites and fascinates you most? Charlie, do you want to kick us off?
I'm gonna pass. Come back to me. I gotta think about that.
All right, Barkley. You know.
Boy, that's a toughie. I mean, there's so much going on in the space. I mean, so it seems like a week doesn't go by without an announcement. But what's the thing that, I mean, I think 5G probably is the thing. I mentioned it earlier. It's the thing that I've got my eye on just because it's just so much bandwidth. It's a gateway to so much potential in terms of reducing latency. It's, you know, if it delivers on the promise, you know, to any kind of thing that's gonna increase the amount of throughput in the digital space is really, really important because it touches so many things. I mean, I talked about IoT solutions, self-driving cars. You know, those things, you know, the faster the data throughput, you know, so important. But I've kind of already talked about 5G, so I've broken record.
Justin?
I'm interested in what's next after mobile, right? As we're maturing, you know, it's a mature space. You know, I think 3/4 of the world has a mobile device now. And so I'm super interested to know what that next thing is, AR, VR, mixed reality, things like that, where you take experiences that have been done the same way for as long as we can remember and add different layers to that and expose new ways to consume things, whether it be esports or live sports or you know, taking those sort of second screen experiences and making them a single experience, sort of a single experience or multiple experiences all at one. Like all that kind of stuff really fascinates me, and I'll be curious to know, you know, when things like that start to be a little bit more mainstream.
An interesting point on what's next after mobile. As you know, more and more people have been watching video on mobile devices, but I came across a report the other day that actually said in the last couple of quarters, folks are starting to migrate back to TVs a bit, and they as the most likely reason for that has been the all of the smart TVs that have been selling recently with the reduced prices and such. So we're seeing that trend back to the TV and back to the bundles, right? Almost right back where we started. Luke?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So I think despite the exaggerations of its imminent demise, cryptocurrency still is an area that I'm really interested in particular towards video or content creation. I think there's still a lot of intriguing things happening around micropayments or being able to essentially incentivize or compensate content creators. And so I think anytime you have those types of motivations and that kind of things that doesn't seem to die, I think there's something there. And I think you know, that we see that play out. I think there's plenty of different compensation models effectively that are happening with digital content, especially video. People paying high prices for emojis or rewarding users or doing things like Patreon to compensate content creators. And I think if you can break that down across borders and you know, essentially sort of transition those likes or thumbs ups to micropayments, I think there's some really interesting things that could happen.
All right, thank you. Audrey?
Definitely along the lines of what Luke said around cryptocurrency, but I'm personally really interested in where AI would take videos, because I think a lot of the videos right now, we've got so much content out there and there's so many different catalogs of content. So you don't just have media entertainment, you've got sport, esport is now very big around all the tournaments, the games that people play. So, and you've got the big players out there, but you also have really niche players that's out there that's really analyzing the videos and spitting out really detailed detections of like object detections, mood detections, and how does that affect us in the next stage of OTT? How does it affect us in terms of how we engage with people? So yeah, really interesting in that area.
Great. Charlie? You got
Got
one?
it. Yeah. It's not a specific technology, but definitely I'm interested in seeing how we as providers and innovators are able to provide a real-time community engagement back into the content that we provide. We see this done really well in services like Twitch TV, in terms of content creators being able to provide entertainment to their viewers, but then also viewers being able to engage back with their content creators as well as each other. I think that as we shift to more mobile devices and watching at home, as Luke said earlier, we're going to see people kind of partitioning off and watching these experiences in sort of an isolated manner, but there's still a community that they come back to engage with that content, whether that's the next day after watching Game of Thrones coming back up. Being able to provide that same level of engagement in real time, specifically around sports, like acting as if you were in the stadium with other fans celebrating that goal or that touchdown. It's going to be really interesting to see how technology leverages that sort of engagement to bring people back together after the technology has isolated us to be able to watch it anywhere in the world.
Great. That's actually a great transition into our first Q&A question, which comes from Diego. And Diego's asking, which specific metadata do you capture from users to deliver information to the producers in order to predict what should be produced? Charlie, Justin, do you want to take that one? They kind of rephrase it as, what analytics do you collect to kind of decide on what content to produce?
Good question. I mean, we basically, we've got metadata is difficult, so we're doing our best. It definitely takes a village to get proper metadata, but it's essential for understanding the types of content people are watching and the types of content to produce. So we're constantly faced with like, what's the amount of production that we're willing to put in? And so we're constantly analyzing like what types of content are working based on that metadata, and then what was the cost to produce that piece of content. And there's definitely been some evolution in terms of our strategic plays in that regard, where we've explored sort of full-scale films and the types of really evergreen style pieces of content versus just grab an iPhone and get premium access behind the scenes that otherwise you'd never see, and which is really low production value. And so there's cases to be made for both. But I think just around like premium minutes watched and like things like that are essential for the types of decisions, types of content we're producing.
Great, thank you. We have one question from Sergio asking, what are the predictions between OTT services and regular pay TV? Barclay, do you want to take that one?
Well, there's a lot of talk, a lot of attention in the digital press about the rise of OTT, virtual MVPDs, the skinny bundles. And there's definitely been a growth. I read the Nielsen study I referenced earlier, said that MVPD penetration is 3.7% of US households, whereas traditional pay television is still in, I think, 76% of households. So, and consumption of traditional television is still the single largest type of media that is consumed. So, is it so I don't think, I'm not buying into this notion that one's going to replace the other. It's like, by the way, you realize people still listen to like an hour and 40 minutes of terrestrial radio every day on average? That was the thing that was going to be gone when television started. So I guess I'm old fashioned in that respect. I see all this as additive, and I think that it can definitely be a great benefit to a video consumer who's looking for choice. There's a lot of experimentation going on in the space. There's a lot of offerings. Some will survive, others won't. But I do think that we talked about this, Luke mentioned the sort of death by 1,000 cuts of having to subscribe to 7 different services. wouldn't it be great if there was a service you could just pay one bill and get pretty much everything? And it's kind of like we're back where we started, because that's sort of the traditional paid TV model. So I think that they can coexist, and it'll just evolve.
Great. Kind of a follow-up onto that one. We have a question for Andy, Luke, that you might want to cover. Do you see OTT delivery by advanced networks such as 5G replacing digital satellite and digital terrestrial broadcast within the next decade?
Ooh, get my crystal ball. I mean, I think you see, right? You see the business models changing. I think how the technology gets implemented and succeeds, I'm not sure, right? It's still been 10-ish years, or maybe a few more since HD fully rolled out. People have been, we've had 4K access for quite a while, I think, but still that is not really made a big, it hasn't really reached a lot of homes other than through IP. And I think part of that is because the IP transition is going to be really transformational how video gets delivered versus kind of your standard coax delivery. And so I think you see things, somewhat related, right? Like DirecTV basically said, or AT&T said, they're not going to put another DirecTV satellite in the sky, right? So most of their investments moving towards terrestrial delivery of content. And so if you kind of just look at how are those incumbent operators going to have to change their business to address the 5G world, I don't exactly know quite yet. I think, as Barclay mentioned, there's new headlines every week that sort of change the landscape and maybe evolve how everyone's thinking about it. And I think as you see more and more of those kind of incumbent players make, whether it's M&A or big investments, or start to take risks outside of their normal portfolio of kind of standard operating procedure, I think that will either kind of draw out the transition or decrease the time it takes to transition. But it'll take longer. Usually with any software, it's always predicted that it's going to happen faster than it is and takes longer. I think the radio stat is a good one. That's definitely true. And I think the transition even to HD or transition to 4K is just kind of, I think consumers are getting like content saturation right now. So it'll be a bit of like, what are they really going to be paying for that's worth it to get extra? Is that quality? Is that convenience? Is that specific hit shows that we don't even know about yet? There's a lot to unpack there. So I'm just as interested as anybody to see how it plays out.
All right. So Jose is interested in finding out our thoughts about interactive content like Black Mirror or Bandersnatch on Netflix. Did anyone see that or have an opinion or thoughts? Who wants to take that one?
I think just commenting wise, I think there's been kind of the questions around how do you take feedback and how do you incorporate that into production. So I think taking things like social cues, being able to you can use ML, right, to do things like sentiment analysis on social channels and be able to take feedback. You can use your analytics data if you're smart about it and figure out, optimal time to release content, optimal windowing of content, optimal time and length of content. So there's a lot of things that I think with data you couldn't get before. And I think Netflix just showed with that example a really good way to use it. I think the interactivity of content and sort of mobile gaming, things like HQ has obviously raised a lot of interest in what else can you do besides just one directional video. What else can you do? And I think that's kind of the area that a lot of people are looking at. And the great news is they've got better tools than ever before to actually produce those experiences.
All right.
No, I can definitely add to it. So I definitely think that's a path that producers and production is going to go down, because I know in Asia, quite a few productions sort of reshot their final scenes and the final result based on the social media feed. Now, given what Netflix has tried, you can actually select and really want to choose what you want and how you want the storylines, how you want to create your storylines, and based on what you like is one of the bigger thing that people will go, oh, that's to my taste. That's how I want to see it. It also goes down to a style of personalization to the content that you want. So you're now being put in the producer's seat, you're now being put in the director's seat, so that you can actually determine the type of content and obviously what you want to see the content goes to. So definitely one of the areas I think will grow and shine more and more.
Great. So we have a question from Juan on what's your opinion about the advertising field over OTT content, like advertising on VOD or live VOD? Berkeley, do you want to have some thoughts on that?
Not really. Sorry to disappoint, obviously. Obviously, the metadata feedback chain and, well, just quality of experience, the sort of viewing metrics that can be harvested offer, you know, a great deal of information as to where the engagement is, but it's not really my area of expertise. So I don't want to, maybe someone else can contribute something more relevant.
Any other thoughts on advertising in AVOD and OTT?
Yeah, it's interesting how the advertising model in terms of versus the subscription model. Advertising, certainly people would love to turn the ads off, but it's still one of the preferred monetization method from a lot of vendors. So that sort of then ties into the type of advertising content that's being served to you, which was back to the personalization part, which I was talking about, which I said, for me, it's really interesting. So when do you actually serve an ad, and who do you actually serve the ad to, and the type of ad that's being served to you? So for example, if you're watching a James Bond movie, and when he pours the drinks and pours a red wine, potentially that's where you can actually serve a red wine ad to a female viewer. And then when the car drives across the scene, then you serve a different type of ad to a male viewer. So that then drives different engagement, different interest. So then people goes, oh, okay, I don't want the ad so much. That also really targets the type of ad, but that really then depends on, obviously, can we really do that around the content? So yeah, I still think advertising is that type of model will stay, but we may see a shift in terms of the shift in changing how we actually serve the types of ad content out.
Yeah, I can add to that. I think that's a really good point, and specifically around live video in sports specifically. When Audrey mentioned that there are clear breaks in the action, and a lot of times there's really nothing to see on the field, and so we as producers are left with options in terms of what do we show to the user when there's nothing exciting going on. We can either try to come up with highlights and engage the user that way, but a lot of times it's advertisements. That's the most relative and interesting content to show to somebody, personalization becomes important there in terms of like what is an ad that the user might actually enjoy seeing, whether that's upcoming previews for the next game that's coming up. That's an advertisement to try to bring the user back onto the platform. So I think live video specifically in sports, it's a little bit clearer cut.
Great. And then just to add my two thoughts as we wrap here, not specifically on AWOD, but I'd love to see the OTT space start innovating a bit more on monetization and maybe taking a lesson from the gaming world. Right? As we move to OTT, the brand of the channel isn't really as important as it once was, right? It's not must-see NBC TV anymore like it was back in the 90s. People just want to see Game of Thrones, whatever channel it might be on or where it might be available, right? So are there potentially opportunities to provide customized themes for a channel for a particular individual, or like branding their particular player, or like I said, taking a lesson from the gaming world, where you're doing micro transactions rather than AVOD or subscriptions, right? Based on that personalization, or maybe it's the ability to skip ads that you pay little microtransactions for that. So unfortunately, that is all the time we have for this webinar. Thank you to everyone joined and your attention and all of your questions. And a special thank you to all of the participants. Thank you for taking the time. It was great, interesting discussion, all the great points that were brought up. So we appreciate everyone taking the time to attend. Stay tuned for upcoming webinars from Globant. And don't worry, we've recorded this conversation. And to those attendees that registered, we'll send a recording out via email. And for those that we didn't get to your question, I believe we had a handful left. We'll try to address those in the follow-up emails as well. I'll include my email address in that recording. Thank you, everyone, and talk to you soon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Marlon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, Marlon.
Bye.
Good meeting everyone.